I sit in an institution and outside of an institution. My job in my head is to create as much trouble as possible. So, but by that, it's kind of enabling lateral thinking. It's constantly challenging and coming up with solutions. So what if? No, what if we do this? But no, we have to do it like this. No, but what if we did it like that? I love that sense of freedom of doing something like that, which I think is inherently tied into art and creativity. But it sits really quite awkwardly in an institution, doesn't it?
Yeah, I guess all troublemaking becomes institutionalized eventually, doesn't it? I mean, isn't that the kind of trajectory or the fate of rebellions, is that they eventually become the establishment?
And is that the goal?
I don't think any rebellious kid ever imagines that they're going to be the cantankerous old git.
Yeah, I'd love to be that cantankerous old woman that's still kicking against the system, and hasn't quite grown up yet. Because you're teaching as well, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm always thinking of my work as teaching in some way. I mean, if people can learn something from it, that's great. I've always thought of my artistic practice as somehow, sharing perspectives that might be useful to other people and learning as much. But yeah, but I also now teach within an institution. It took me a lot of emotional labor, I guess, to get to the point where I could take this job in an institution. I felt a bit like I was betraying my sort of hunter-gatherer, nomadic, peripatetic freelance at Queen Mary, University of London, which is a big institution. It's a corporate entity. A university nowadays is a huge business. Maybe it always was, but it's big. It's a kind of operation almost.
Yeah, no, I mean, and it's interesting because when I kind of went back into academia, and I was a filmmaker. I worked for BBC and broadcasters and all sorts. But when I went back into an institution, it was very different from when I studied at university. But I saw that transition from education focused to customer focus, and the language really quite grated with me. And I remember thinking, actually, when I was at university, it was about trying to find solutions to challenging, and all of a sudden we were in a system. We were in a system, and we had to say, yes, this is how you do things, rather than encouraging kind of this, this kind of creative exploration. I was reading yesterday. I was Rod Stoneman and Duncan Petrie's paper. Well, it was a book that they wrote in 2014 about film schools and radicalisation, the past, present, and future. And where they started, back in the early 1920s, with the old Eisenstein and, being brought in by the Soviet government. But in some way, there was a push and exploration of ideology in that system. And you've got these fantastic movements that came out of that. And then this change post-war. And again, you had new movements that were challenging the system that brought some really innovative filmmakers. But then with neoliberalism, we introduced this very economic and commercialised focus within film schools. And this separation between, which I thought was really quite interesting because I come from industry, this separation between industry-focused and thought-focused, and separating the two in film schools. So you have media studies, but then you have practical filmmaking. And the practical filmmaking was aimed at industry, and media studies was aimed at the theory, and the two would never meet. The two have this disdain for each other. Where we should be, I think, as Stoneman was saying, is actually the two should be fusing. So something like the New School is saying actually we should be fusing this, because we should be looking at how we can come up with innovations, new things, not pander to the existing system or pander to commercialisation or the industry. We should be looking at new thoughts.
It seems to me that film maybe hasn't moved so far from early propaganda vehicles to sort of the Hollywood dream factory. Maybe it's not such a change of function. But I'm interested in, like you're saying, you went from academia to the industry, right? And then you came back to academia, but it's, there are similar pressures perhaps, or maybe they've become more similar now. The notion of the customer and the auteur or something, the tension between the creative genius of the filmmaker or the scholar or the expert, and the kind of, the requirements of who want to buy the products or who are being sold the products.
Yes, when you're in industry, you're constantly thinking of food for the body rather than food for the soul. It's kind of that balance between the two, feast or famine. And that kind of perpetuates this push to afford, this whole idea of affordability. Can you afford to study the arts? Can you afford to get into that space? It's an indulgence because we're kind of working towards a mechanism, an economic mechanism. And this pendulum is saying, well, show us your return on investment. Language like that, your ROIs. Whereas I have to say that when I kind of came back into academia and I came back into an art school, I absolutely loved the tension between where I'd come from and my fellow artists who were in the art school, who were just at a different pace. And then when we started working together, we'd have this really, really kind of bizarre tension, which was creative, but we'd keep pushing against each other, but having a great time and creating something really quite fun. And I think filmmaking has moved on. But I don't know, what about yourself? I mean, coming from I know only a little bit that I've picked up from reading about you, but I know nothing really, Ansuman, about you.
Yeah, me neither, really. Yeah, I don't know what you might have picked up. I don't know what I can tell you. I mean, I balk at the notion of an industry as an artist. I think my real starting point in my work was anti-industry. Was like actually deliberately not producing useful stuff. That's the definition of industry, isn't it? Industry's hard work. I mean, that's what I think. Being industrious is like being hardworking, and industry is like stuff that produces outputs, that makes like things that are useful and that are the product of sweat and struggle. Yeah, everything that I chose to do when I was in a position to make conscious choices was to subvert industry, to do things for play, for love, for passion, for itself, and not for an output, not for something that might be commodifiable. So, for instance, I work with music a lot. It kind of began, that process for me began, I was doing a drama degree at Manchester University. And in fact, I went to Manchester to do a drama degree because I was really interested in writing. That's what I've always been really interested in, poetry particularly. Someone told me that English, I was going to study English. I was going to go to Oxford, for instance, to study English. And unfortunately, I read a bit too much Ivan Illich, particularly a book called Deschooling Society when I was about 16, 17 or something. And it put me off school. And it made me think about university in a different way than my parents might have hoped. I was going to study English. I was really into writing, and someone told me that drama is just like English, but you don't sit down. So I thought, yeah, great, I want to be on my feet, I want to be active, I want to be doing stuff, and just couldn't see the connection with myself. I couldn't see what was going on there. This was before any notion, well, not really any mainstream notion of the decolonization of the curriculum, for instance. I couldn't see myself. I couldn't see any reflection of my heritage or identity in academia at that time. Anyway, while I was kind of disengaging from this drama department at Manchester University, some drums landed on me. They came through the window and fell on me, and I started playing. I don't know where they came from. They fell out of the sky. I had a ground floor flat at the time with a sort of whistle. Right.
Is this for real? Is this metaphorical or is this for real?
Totally true. This is totally what happened.
Right. Awesome.
Plywood bongos fell on me and hurt my knee. But I started playing them, and I found. So what I was trying to say is that it was music that started me off on this path of decommodification, and it was through playing music And deliberately, actually, as I got more and more into it, it was a process of, it was a kind of shamanic process of being led by the music, really. And I made decisions, for instance, not to get into recording music, for example, and to focus more and more on improvisation, for instance, as an art form. So I was very consciously decommodifying, I guess, and wanting to be anti-industrial, to not be industrious, although I worked really hard at music. And then later I went on and I studied at Dartington College of Arts, which was a totally different kind of academic institution. And I got into live art, I got into performance. And so that's a lot of what I do now. Strangely, after years of skirting around the edges of academia, I'm now teaching live art and contemporary performance at Queen Mary. But I'm also at another university, University of East London, as a student, getting my accreditation from the BACP, which is the British Association of Counsellors and Psychotherapists. So I'm getting into, I've had a live art one-to-one practice for a while, and I'm moving that into a kind of more overtly therapeutic space. But all my art has always, there's been a didactic element, there's been a therapeutic element, there's been a healing element, there's been a self pedagogy, if you like. So that's kind of where I'm at the moment. So I've got my own practice, I'm a student and I'm a teacher.
I think I'm desperately jealous because I was always driven by anger, and never really known myself. So music that would actually give voice to that anger, and I think part of it is related to it is identity. Growing up in a particular Thatcher's Britain, that we are now seeing the spawn of, and we're swimming in disgracefully.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up in South East London. I grew up in Sidcup, which was next door to the BNP headquarters in Welling. Convenient. And it was really quite handy for marches and for, getting kettled and, experiencing the experience that you can say you've got the stripes for it, But it meant that I actually grew up with a lot of ska, indie, rock, punk. We'd have to. Sidcup had this sign by the local church. It said, massive sign that said, Sidcup is the second most boring place in the UK. Join us and make it the third. Right. that was its aspiration. That's I used to take the night bus out and into London and, go to gigs at the Palais and the Odeon in Camden and, kind of experiencing something which was very different to what I was growing up in that space. So I had a lot of that, and that drive was a very political drive. And so I think I've had almost a very opposite self-realization, driven to anger. But the education environment was, university for me was, I'd be going around in my 8-holers or my 12-holers, my Doc Martens and, carrying my placards and all that kind of stuff. And the people around me were softening me, and I was trying to not be softened. I was there thinking I must read and I must write. And then I got, it was like, oh, look, there's softer music, there's softer people, there's a fusion of thought. There's gigs and parties and all of that, but it's a community, it's a community of people around you. But then going into another institution, going into the BBC as an institution, and everything that comes with that. I've made films, I've made radio programs, which I absolutely love. I love making radio. I love it, absolutely love it. And I love the space that music can take you into. I made a series, it was called Beyond Skin, which was after Nitin Sawhney's album, short films. The BBC just left it alone because it was £2.50 per film, really. Just go off and do whatever you want to do. And that for me was a liberating point. Just actually making films in a different way, in a different space. And now for academia, you know, going back in, and I run a research institute, and the light bulb has been going on and on and on and on, and more conversations I have with Michael, you know, about the new school and other spaces. I mean, I feel like I'm in quite a privileged position here where I experiment with the form. Say what if. So, and the form is no longer a 2D form. It's a 3D form. It's immersive. It's 360. It's, you know, playing with rhythms in the soul, with the mind, connecting with people on a bodily level, heartbeats, breaths, you know, just trying to understand in that psychological way, you know, the impact and the power of film. But if you combine it and you make it a smorgasbord of so many different things, but in order to play, I need to bring an income in. So I have to pay for my play. And that balance is, you know, that's interesting because then it sucks out maybe that freedom of creating.
But you have many more resources available to you now than you did when you were figuring out whether you're going to get an 8-hole or a 12-hole.
Yeah, and absolutely. I think this is really it's an incredible point that we're in. I see it, and I know that word industry is a harsh word, but I've kind of grown up believing in anarcho-syndicalism. You know, I grew up in a space of thinking about communities and unions as a way forward. That whole idea of utopia. I was saying something to Michael yesterday. It was a quote from, which is written into one of the plaques in the Escuela in Havana. It's a film school in Havana, which is so that the place of utopia, which by definition has no place, has a place. And the light bulb went on in my head. You know, for me, it was a series of structures that construct for society to actually work together as a community. But actually, it's about how you perceive, you know, it's about changing that perspective. It's about, you know, the opposite of industry, your space, you know, that kind of kicking against the system, but in a different way, disruptive. Mine has always been externally disruptive. I think this internal disruption is new to me. They hit the third age.
So if I understand you properly, you're saying there's a place for a way of approaching things which has no place, or utopia is a place that has no place, and there's a place for that.
Yes, I know, it's bizarre. I mean, this whole idea of utopia, which I think, you know, most people aim towards, is this utopic sense of being, and whatever's in that utopia, whether it's kindness, generosity, music, creativity. So I have a 15-year-old. Okay, she was 14 during the lockdown, and when the shops opened after the first lockdown, I gave her a card and just said, "There you go. Go into." They went into a bookstore. I said, "Go buy anything." She went with her cousin, and they came back with a pile of books, and each and every book was political. And one of the books was by Rutger Bregman, and it's called Utopia for Realists. And it's a fantastic book. And she was just flicking through, and she brought it back. And it was about, you know, it's basically about hope, but it was also about debunking the system, debunking what we've been fed. You know, that the economy has to run in a particular way, that education has to be run in a particular way, that we need taxes, that we need 5-day weeks, that we need a 9 to 5.
By being part of the institution, by being part of the system to a greater degree. I mean, you know, perhaps we're all implicated in some degree, but we try to maintain some kind of independence or critical awareness or something.
When I work with young people, I love it when they challenge me. I love these discourses where they go, "Well, I don't know, I disagree with that." I'm like, great, why? You know, what else? What, you know, when we're making films, I just came back from filming on location, so we're on a road trip for about a week and a half. And I said, bring your music. And they were a little bit embarrassed about playing their music. And I said, why? And they said, because you'll be judgmental. I said, no, I want to listen to your music. but also, tell me about yourselves. These conversations are great. The conversations you can have on a road trip, about passion, about love, about what drives you, about what you want to change, why you're in this. Because I'm not operating in the classroom, I'm now in this kind of practice-based research world. It's quite interesting because we're sitting in live examples. So, for example, we're working with the police. Okay, we've been commissioned by the police to create an immersive experience to challenge attitudes around gang crime and violence and knife crime. Now, you're never going to create an experience that's going to prevent this happening. It's a
It's a utopia.
yeah, absolutely. You might create something that would ask people to reflect and possibly change attitudes in this space. But the really interesting thing about this project is that working on it, which was just by chance, is we're working with a young chap who has lived experience. He's been in gangs, he is stabbed, and he's been stabbed. He's in a space where you don't trust the police, But here is something that somebody in this structure has said, well, what if we could do something in this space? We're not quite sure what it is because that's not what we do. But hey, you artists, you creators, you kind of do something. We're not quite sure what. It's about empowering. And so, we're creating something in this space which is in a way challenges the structure. It challenges overarching assumptions because it's coming from somebody who's been through this and not been subjugated to this, if that makes sense. They're actually bringing their own kick against the system into creating the project, but it's actually part of the structure itself. So instead of having these oppositional forces, it's like they're the bad guys, actually working with those that can see how these boundaries are quite fluid, can be fluid, and you can engage and you can interact. Now, you know what? It could just be a waste of money. It could be like, look, we've tried to address something here and we've ticked a box here. And we could be in that space 30 years on from Stephen Lawrence and Melton, and knowing it's still happening. It's still happening in a way, in a society where you've got kids, I've got kids, and we thought they won't experience the things that we've experienced. That watershed moment with Brexit, where things, I don't know for you, but they just like turned overnight, where it was a validation that the society that we're in here is toxic, but it's understanding why it's toxic. And the police, all these institutions are part of the toxicity, but, underneath it all, suppose if we're talking about conspiracy theorists, we know that there are overarching organisations, overarching individuals that are benefiting from perpetuating particular narratives and myths. And sometimes we get distracted by how structures are failing without actually looking at the heart of what's going on.
I'm interested in this in a completely different quality of action. And I wonder about, rather than thinking about rebellion and challenge, Islam means surrender, doesn't it? And there's this there's this quality, I think, in Pali, which is called nikkama in the Pali language, this quality of renunciation, or the idea of surrendering and softening and abandoning. I'm quite interested in those aspects of action, non-violence, listening, maybe, making a space. It seems interesting to me, rather than trying to think about challenging something or opposing something. It's a very different route than political activist, maybe. Or maybe that itself is a we've been sort of co-opted into another kind of polarization by hegemonic forces, But there's a way of being an activist, which might involve just not doing something. I mean, non-cooperation, non-violent non-cooperation is an interesting method, maybe. Yeah, for me, the deepest changes that I've ever seen have happened because of a practice of not action, practice of listening, practice of renunciation and surrender. That's been the sort of had the strongest effects on me and what I've seen and what I've seen in the world. Yeah, you said there was this turning point in Brexit. I remember that. I remember a number of turning points and of the war between toxicity and between light and dark. I remember the optimism when Barack Obama
Mm.
came into office.
Yeah.
I
Yes.
remember how short-lived that was. I remember the optimism when Jeremy Corbyn arrived.
Yes.
You
Yeah.
know, I remember.
And Blair.
Wow, God, yeah,
Mm.
wow, yeah. But maybe winning and losing isn't actually that helpful.
When you're talking about listening, I completely agree. But it's about who are we listening to and where are these voices? And some of these voices can't be heard. I just spent a year making a film with healthcare workers in the US and the UK, and I was just fascinated about how they were using social media to get their stories out there because they were being sat on, you know, deliberately. These stories weren't getting out, and they're still not getting. And how they used different means to just try and make sense of the world that they were in, whether it's art, fine art, photography, writing, and then negotiating these lines of truth, seeing the truth, not hearing the truth, and having to deal with things that they didn't actually sign up for. I completely agree about listening, but if we can hear those voices, and there are a lot of voices that we can't hear, and sometimes we don't want to hear as well. There's a lot of that. I do that. I can't hear that voice anymore. I can see it. It makes me uncomfortable. So I just need to turn away from that. But that whole idea of inactivity is really interesting, Ansuman, because it goes against everything I do. So this idea of trying to encourage, I suppose, what this conversation is about as well, that kind of rhizomatic structure, these the loom bands that you were talking about, the fact that we can connect in different ways. A lot of the time we're kind of kept apart in our own little pods, and being open to new ways of thinking and to new ways of learning, I think.
I've had a long-standing interest in new schools. I don't know about this one in particular, the new school of the
Mm.
Anthropocene, but I've certainly. I mean, I went to Dartington because it was based on Shantiniketan, which was Tagore's new idea of an educational system, which was a revolutionary idea in the sense that it was positioned against the British rule of India,
Mm.
and it was about indigenous Indian systems of knowledge exchange and of education and of the culturing of civilization. So Shantiniketan was a beautiful example of a new school, and there have been many others, Black Mountain College and Dartington and the Bauhaus. Or now I'm working with, for instance, Dougal Hine, who is based in Sweden at the moment, been working on uncivilization and the Dark Mountain movement. So there's various schools that I know of. For me, the most enduring example of an educational structure that is rhizomatic in the way that you describe and is based on inaction is the practice of Vipassana meditation as it's been taught by S.N. Goenka, who is a teacher in a long tradition of Theravada Buddhist tradition, which is a 2,500 year long tradition, which has survived through teachers and small groups of students, well, small or large groups of students. At some times in history, it's been huge universities and swathes of the world have been passing on this knowledge from the Pali scriptures, and other times it's been tiny bands of people sort of reading by the guttering light of a flame as the roof drips onto the parchment or something, trying to keep the teachings alive. So there's been times of more or less resourcing of the teaching, but because it's been rhizomatic and because it's been relevant to so many different cultures and so many different times, epochs, it survived for a long time and it continues to survive. And for me, it's the most inspiring teaching that I've ever come across. And its central tenet is inaction.
I know we shouldn't be using words like challenged, but I feel I need to be exposed to this at my third age, that idea of inaction. As I said, it goes against every single grain in my being.
Yes, it does. I'm not surprised because it's activity is evolutionarily hardwired. I mean, we exist because of the urge to activity, to reproduce, to eat, engage with the environment, and be as successful as possible. That is in the grain of our being. But it's also painful. There's a pain in desire and the kind of engine that moves one on to the next thing in activity. The sort of shadow of that is dissatisfaction. And so, that's in us. That's totally in every cell of our body. And so it takes a huge effort. And it's you talk about wanting to know the nuts and bolts of it. It's a surgical act into our kind of organism to excise unskillful activity. I mean, you have to put it down to inactivity in order to just clear away all the kind of superfluous or even counterproductive activity, and then perhaps create some kind of skillful, playful, joyful, beautiful action. That can come. I mean, there's beauty in action, absolutely. Leela, Leela is the play. But I think in order to sort of sort the wheat from the chaff, you have to sort of learn to be completely inactive for the moment.
Yeah.
I'm reminded of Saraswati's swan. You know the goddess Saraswati. She has a swan in Hindu mythology, who has this capability with its beak. It's got this magical ability to drink and separate milk from water. But that kind of wisdom, that sort of discernment happens when you have a completely empty space where the slightest sort of activity, the slightest oscillation, it becomes apparent.
I mean, it's that state of, I want to say nirvana, but
You can if you like.
okay, I'll say nirvana. But the space of just being in the moment it's very hard for all of us to be just in that moment because we're always in the future. And then a lot of that probably boils down to the reason for being. And then you get into that deep philosophical question of, well, am I here to change? Am I here just to be? Am I here just to exist? Am I here just to experience? Then that opposite of inactivity is, well, actually, whilst I'm here, I might as well do something. I need to make my existence meaningful.
But I mean, you were just making me think then, like, where does the activity come from? Like, it's very apparent that there's a lot of suffering. There's a lot of people struggling. There's a lot of unhappiness. There's a lot of people in pain. There's a lot of people who are crying out because they're trapped and they're crushed by something, and so activity comes out of compassion, and that's also where teaching comes. The activity is teaching.
Absolutely, and I think the action of listening is important. There's a huge conversation happening at the moment about inaction or inactivity, about the state that we're in at the moment, this turning away and not holding people to account for things that are happening that could be avoidable. So in a way, is inaction counterproductive to humanity, and is that inaction also, in a way, a luxury?
Do you know the Mahabharata? I'm just you're reminding me of like lots of um, like my childhood sort of Indian stories, I guess. There's an old king who's blind, in the Mahabharata, and there's this kind of image of inactivity, which is blindness.
Mm.
You can't see, you don't
Yeah.
see, so there's nothing to act on. That's not inactivity. That's just idiocy, or yeah, that's turning away. That's the turning away that you're talking about, which isn't really inactive. It's an action. To look the other way
Mm.
is a very decisive act, but to see and to remain inactive, to suspend judgment while fully feeling, that's the tough bit. To keep your eyes open, to keep your senses open, and yet to not act, because we are conditioned by however many billions of years of our evolution, of our growth. We're conditioned to move away from pain and move towards pleasure. So to choose to suspend that movement for a moment, it's tough. It takes some
Mm.
patience. Patience is the ultimate action.
Gosh, I don't really. No, I was about to kick back against what you were saying. So
Right.
I suppose this is what schooling should be. This is what education should be. This is what learning should be. It's about presenting different schools of thought and trying to avoid using the word challenge. I don't think I've summed up particularly well. So, Ansuman, I don't know if you want to sum up.
I mean, we've been asked to have a conversation, and that's what this is. Pretty freewheeling. I mean, I find it's easiest to talk from the heart if I don't prepare my responses, and then I'm authentic. And that's what I would love to share with people. I think that's what a university could be about. As anthropos, we could set our sights for authenticity.